12. On the world rejecting religion. One of the most significant consequences of this morally nihilistic attitude is that it is a kind of practical worldview that serves as the last and most reliable refuge and shelter for the non-resistor. This rejection of the external world is apparently based on moral grounds, but in reality it is rooted in a vague and inconsistent religious conception of the external world. The moralist, as we have already established, leads a life wrapped up in himself, and as a result he turns away from everything that is not his own soul with its sinful and virtuous delights. It is clear then that the whole external world recedes into the background and fades in its reality. Investing his inner world with the supreme and only value, virtuous pity and pitying pleasure, the moralist's soul does not appreciate and does not cultivate the centrifugal gradient of life. It is difficult for him to escape this attitude and turn to the outside world, and if he is forced to consider something external, he agrees to this only insofar as this material has a touching, sentimental, idyllic character. Everything else is denounced, rejected, and condemned to an exception as immoral. This is the reasoning behind the fact that Tolstoy has two opposite views on nature and on human society, these two great parts of the external world. According to the first view, nature is divine and blessed. It was created by God. It is connected with him to such an extent that its law is his law, so that religion establishes man's connection not only with God, the first cause, but also with the endless and infinite universe that came from him. God's will not only fails to depart from these eternal, immutable laws of nature, but directly corresponds to them. The fulfillment of these laws is the fulfillment of his will. The world is driven by love, and even animals live in it peacefully and do not offend each other. It is clear that the human flesh, created by God and introduced as a component of external nature, is not condemned, but is acceptable. The person is given the law of labor and the law of childbearing. The law of eternal unchanging is the law of God and the will of God sent to the world, and the woman, giving birth to children, does not sin but serves God. The connection with nature is recognized as the direct condition of happiness and virtue. The labor required to overcome its elements is the first and indubitable duty of man. The unity of people with each other is declared the highest good, attainable by men in our times. This idyllic view of the outside world, according to which everything rests on love, and in which violence is simply not necessary, is opposed by a second, contradictory understanding. According to Tolstoy again, the external world is a world of sin, sadness, and strife. It abides in evil and is full of offense. It reigns irresistible, the law of struggle for existence and the experience of the most capable. This has control over the life of the entire organic world, and hence over that of man, regarded as an animal. It is the law of evolution eternal for all living things, which is at the same time contrary to the law of morality. The moralist does not accept this world of discord, contest, and competition. This world lives outside of morality and against morality, driven by natural, greedy, ruthless, shameless instincts that seek pleasure in sin and are cursed to enjoy sin. No matter how a man may paint this discord and this sin, that struggle will always remain a struggle, that is, an activity absolutely excluding the possibility of Christian morality as professed by us. Therefore, all forms and varieties of this struggle of people with each other are reprehensible and forbidden. Economic competition, which develops technology and material culture, and the struggle that ignites because of sexual love, and the social and political struggle for authority and for power. It is this view of the external world as a deeply immoral environment which leads to the proclamation of asceticism, the simple life, and non-resistance. A moralist is a creature frightened and depressed by the prohibitive, intrusive, pretentious reality of his body and his instinctual drives. These attractions he experiences, which are directed to the outside world, are offensive, hostile. Starting from the struggle for food and shelter, for property, wealth, and power, and ending with the aggressiveness of the sexual instinct and its struggle for possession. All this entails violence. All this puts one on the path of the devil and draws one into mortal sin. All this awakens the animal personality in man and turns him into a cruel beast. All this comes from the external world and pulls one into the external world. All this should be kept to a minimum and, ideally, completely suppressed. So, in nature, there overflows a certain morality that is not considered as licentious, yet which alas not only disturbs the person, but lives in him and continually rises in his soul in the form of sinful lust. This sinful lust is perceived by the moralist in himself as the beginning of evil, as endlessly and insatiably stirring in the soul of adversarial virtues. It is clear that the moral law categorically demands its suppression. To surrender to this lust is unworthy of a man, humiliating, is disgraceful and sinful. Virtue demands that a man pity others, and not lead them to sin through shame and pain, enjoying their suffering. Virtue requires chastity, full chastity. Marriage cannot contribute to serving God and neighbor, and carnal love is serving oneself. Thus should be replaced by the pure relationship of brother and sister. Let the human race cease carnality. People are still familiar with this idea, some on the basis of religious belief, others on the basis of scientific forecast. The birth of children would be permissible for a compassionate moralist only in the event that he saw that all existing children were provided for. Austerely rejecting from the start the flesh and the instinct in himself as the beginning of the external, the anti-spiritual, violence and evil, the moralist categorically demands that a person should indulge as little as possible in his corporeality so that he reduces his needs to the most necessary, and invests all his bodily energy into only worthy persons, morally honest and honorable, who do not offend or exploit physical labor. Only those who work physically work. Every other mental work is imaginary. It is empty talk and deception. To be morally lofty, a person must forget all licentiousness and bury his deceptions. He must simplify life and bid it farewell. Simplifying life is necessary, both internally and externally, so that neither needs nor attitudes arise that lead to a world of violence. It is necessary to simplify the culture of social organization, economy, environment, clothes and furniture, excluding and eliminating from everywhere an element of external violence in the use of someone else's work. It is necessary to abolish land ownership, hiring and renting, the leisure time necessary for spiritual creativity, powers and laws, sexual love and luxury, factory production and money, hunting and meat-eating, interfering with anyone else's life, the army, in short, all that imposes upon the person the external, the natural and the social world. We must descend to the level of primitive simplicity that is accessible to all people around the world, so that everyone does only what everyone can do, and everyone serves himself without borrowing from others and without interfering in what they want to do. It is in connection with this world rejection that the demand to refrain from an active, suppressing struggle with evil grows. The external world lies in evil, and in terms of knowledge of it, man is extremely limited. Therefore, he must consistently withdraw his own will from it, leaving it to the inevitable. The question, writes Leo Tolstoy, of what one should do in the presence of a crime committed by one or by a great number is based upon the gross superstition that affirms the possibility of foreseeing the future and changing it according to one's will. For a man who is free from such a superstition, this is not a question and can never be. I do not know, and no one can know, if the use of violence or resignation when threatened with evil will be useful or useless, harmful or harmless. Let us suppose that a brigand is raising his knife over his victim. I see him and am armed with a revolver, so I can kill him, but I am not absolutely certain what the brigand will do. He might not strike, while I would surely kill him. Whatever happens in external public life, a person must remember that everyone controls himself and only himself. We must remember this and not sin ourselves, and not to think about the consequences of the actions of others, for that information can never be available to us. This is the concept of the external world which we find in the works of Count Tolstoy, with all its implications. He contemplates the world as a God-arranged idol, and then rejects coercion as absolutely unnecessary. Or he contemplates the world as a kind of realm of passions, sin and lies, in which coercion, perhaps, would be both necessary and expedient, but from which a person must turn away lest they end up participating in society. Both these interpretations of the external world are connected by one common thread, the rejection of violence, and, psychologically speaking, both of them, perhaps, directly grow out of the moral need to reject it. Violence is not necessary if the world with all its laws gracefully comes from God. Violence is an unacceptable transgression if the world lies in evil. A sentimental moralist then consoles himself with a cosmic idol, and following this, runs away from the world, leaving it to its fate. However, he seeks comfort and escape, and, justifying the correctness of this escape, as if to protect his passive virtue and his internal pleasure, all of this is covered up and defended by a reference to the will of God. According to these reassuring instructions, the external world, although it lies in evil and temptations, although it is governed by the immoral law of struggle, is nevertheless dealt with by God's will. It is just so that people should always pity each other and not think about what will come of it. One must, to the exclusion of everything else, regard his relation to the world as consisting in fulfilling the will of him who sent him hither, of which the operation of the reason and love wherewith he is endowed makes him aware, and to grant the consequences of such a thing to God's discretion. For these consequences are the work of God. It is from God that everyone is responsible only for himself and that no one has a right or even the possibility to organize the lives of others. It's up to everyone to organize, to observe only one's life, and therefore, at the sight of evil, a person must do nothing, granting the sinner to repent or not repent, be corrected or not be corrected, without interfering or encroaching upon his inner world, upon this sphere of God's guidance. Such an invasion, Such a departure from the limits of his being would mean an attempt to appropriate God's right, usurp God's power, to sacrilegiously replace the will of God as allegedly insufficient, but such an attempt is always tantamount to denying God. Therefore, all I can do in defense of the neighbor under threat of being killed is to offer the villain to be content with killing me. If he is not interested in my proposal and prefers to kill his victim, then it remains for me to see in this the will of God. This is the practical worldview at which Leo Tolstoy arrives, departing from his sentimental morality, moving forward with all his nihilistic straightforwardness, and not noticing any difficulties or contradictions. A myopic and paranoid moral court breaks into the very essence of a living worldview, judges, criticizes, and rejects, neither giving nor experiencing, nor seeing, nor reflecting, allowing nothing to either be born or to blossom into a new form, a court which operates under not a specifically moral, in the religious, scientific, or spiritual sense, criteria and viewpoint. And here spiritual nihilism is filled with a nihilistic attitude towards instinct, any feeling of love and procreation. The moralist teaches us to treat the life of instinct, its living mystery, its healthy and spiritually significant depth, all the sacredness of marriage, paternity, and motherhood, with the same negation as he treats the life of the spirit. Pity, turned away from the spirit and exhausted by the sight of someone else's suffering, rejects the basic power of life as both sinful and evil, for it sees a kind of ruthlessness in nature and in instinct, not seeing its mysterious power and its convertibility into spiritual good. A faithful, sentimental moralist demands from nature what she cannot and does not will, and cannot take from her what constitutes her wealth and depth. And since he is accustomed to measuring all perfection with a moral criterion and seeing the divine trend only in pity, he has to condemn the external world and free himself from voluntary participation in it. And what else could be said by the virtue which does not see the divine in anything but itself? If the thrust of the outside world is a craving for violence, leading away from virtue, this is already a pronounced verdict not only in the outside world, which involves the soul in sin, but also on any man that is attracted to violence, and hence the inevitable demand to turn away from the external world, and insofar as it is outside man, and insofar as it is hidden in man himself, at least for this purpose it is necessary to reduce man to the level of primitive barbarism, spiritual blindness, physical uncleanness, and total extinction. If the outside world lies in evil and is subject to the eternal and irresistible law that rules it, is it not immoral, and should not one really be turned away and flee from the world to escape? And here the moralist frees his student from his vocation to participate in the great process of natural spiritual enlightenment and in the great historical battle between good and evil. He relieves him of the task of finding his creative and devotional place in the world of things and people. He removes from him the duty to participate in carrying the burden of the universe. He pushes into his hands a simplified stencil with which to judge the world, and then places him before a dilemma, either ideal or escape, and by this he teaches him moralizing superficiality and irresponsible spiritual desertion. And in instructing a person in such imaginary wisdom and righteousness, he, apparently, does not realize to any extent that his doctrine engenders in the soul a contradictory hubris and blindness. It is this lack of faithful religious self-awareness that allows him to cover his blind retreat with a reference to the will of God. In fact, if the world is created by God, then why is it evil and immoral? And if he is immoral and evil, how can he be part of the will of God? If the world is created by God, then what right does a person have to call for a rejection of the world? And if he runs away from the world, as controlled by the godless law of struggle, then where do these soothing references to the will of God ruling the world come from? However, the sentimental moralist does not consider such things and brings forward the idea of the will of God every time he needs to cover up his own moralizing lack of will. The strong-willed participation of man in carrying the burden of the universe he declares a gross superstition. The true faith is to leave everything that disturbs his soul, the external social evil, up to the will of God. This true faith asserts that every uncontrollable malice and all of its heinous manifestations are sent by God, and that any attempt to stop these evil deeds would be a blasphemy. If we accept this teaching, it turns out that God wants not only that all people love and pity each other, but also that so many people, not succumbing to the compassion and persuasion of others, in a rampant and villainous manner physically attack and kill the virtuous, and spiritually defile children and those of poor character, and, further, it turns out that God absolutely does not want that the activities of these ferocious scoundrels meet organized resistance and suppression. In the course of persuading the villain whom God allows, we have permission to expand the scope of their evil deeds by offering ourselves as sacrifices, and God also resolves that if anyone, instead of giving the villains a new defenseless set of sacrifices and giving them babies to spiritually corrupt, becomes indignant and intends to stop their unspeakable villainy, then God will condemn this as blasphemy and atheism. When the villain is allowed to assault the weak and corrupt the soul of a child, it means that such is pleasing to God. But when someone who is not a villain wants to thwart this villain, it does not please God. The will of God is that no one harms the villains when they harm the non-villain, for according to his will all children, all those weak of character, all good people, are given over unquestionably and undeniably as prey to abusers and villains, whose ferocity remains inviolably sacred for all other people. And anyone who does not understand this or does not agree with such an interpretation of the world, and therefore takes up the sword, preferring to die by the sword rather than treacherously participate in the triumph of evil, is declared an immoral and irreligious man, a villain who does not believe in God. Covering his sentimental lack of will and his short-sighted nihilism with such a monstrous religious construction, attributing to God the will to evil and attributing crime to freedom, moralists do not seem to notice how all this Philistine theology and moralizing leads them into a whole nest of religious contradictions and morally false positions. So, on the one hand, God is love, and wants from people mutual compassion and unity, but on the other hand, he wants villainy, with freedom and impunity for the villains. On the one hand, only good corresponds to the will of God and the human will receives an ideal moral perfection unattainable for it. And on the other hand, everything that is done according to the will of God, and the villain, wicked according to his will, has no reason to refrain from his crimes, but can always cover them with the same reference with which the moralist covers his lack of will. On the one hand, a person must accept the will of God as his, conscience, compassion, and fulfill it in life. Yet on the other hand, a person must extract his will from this sphere, the external world, the liberty of others, in which the will of God originates. But this means that the entire doctrine of the relationship between God's will and human will falls victim to contradiction and arbitrariness. A sentimental moralist then accepts the will of God when this acceptance leads him to a passive enjoyment of pity, and does not accept it when this acceptance would lead him to a heroic, volitional service. This is due to the fact that he addresses God, his gifts, and his tests and tasks, not with all his soul, with all his mind, and with all his strength, but with the sentimentality of his pleasure-seeking and weak-willed heart. Hence why he turns out to be religiously blind in his address to the external world, in all its mysterious complexity, its tragedy of disengagement and volitional tasks, and its essence, which cannot be reduced to either an idle or an ungodly culpability. The religious experience of a moralist is decadent, weak, one-sided, and meager. His religious doctrine is the product of a self-satisfied mind trying to extract divine revelation from pointlessly affectionate compassion. All of his religion is nothing but a morality of sympathy. But this morality and its compassionate approach gives a person not the experience of God's perfection, but only the experience of human compassion. It sees a tormented person and reduces this entire revelation to sympathy over his torment. However, this means that one does not perceive man through God, but instead comprehends God through man, and not a man illuminated with a ray of love for God, but one who obscures the perception of God due to the sympathy which exists for his tormented state. This is why a moralist can find a suffering person, but finds not his relationship with God, his position with respect to God, nor the relationship of God to he who suffers, or to himself, limply and sweetly pitying. All these misunderstandings he tries to pass off as the teachings of Christ. If it is a religion, then it is a religion that connects not man with God, but man with man, and yet this connection is both false and loose. It is not that of the spirit with the spirit in the face of God, but the soul with the soul in the face of earthly torment. This connection is not created by the soul in its entirety, nor by the will, but only by the effect of inner tenderness. It is composed in mutual sympathy for the burdens of personal life, but falls apart in a weak-willed rejection of the general burden at the first sign of true evil. The true religion starts from God and goes to events on earth, whereas this teaching starts from the person and goes to the world. True religion accepts the world through will, but does not wholeheartedly accept the evil which arises within it, and therefore conducts a strong-willed, heroic struggle with it, whereas this doctrine does not even recognize the world because of evil nesting in it, and therefore turns away from evil, away from the world, and away from any kind of willful struggle against it. True religion is a creative flair for virtue, that is, for spirituality and love, whereas this teaching is affirmed as a practical indifference to the work of evil in the world, to the spirituality of man, and to his destiny on earth. True religion accepts the burden of peace as the burden of God in the world, whereas this doctrine rejects the burden of peace and does not comprehend that this world rejection conceals within itself a rejection of God. These are the religious foundations of the sentimental morality. The final word on the matter is a religious lack of will and spiritual indifference, and in this lack of will and indifference one loses the objectivity and strength of religious love, and does not comprehend one's earthly tasks and the means to carry them out, nor one's transformation or achievement in the world.